Welcome to the Compact Murders podcast from compacthistories.com, where we take a look at real murder cases, assassinations and serial killers in short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 65, Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez was born Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez on the 29th of February 1960 in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His early life was marked by instability, violence, and repeated exposure to trauma, factors that would later feature heavily in attempts to understand his crimes, though never to excuse them. Ramirez's father, Julian Ramirez, was a former police officer who became prone to anger and physical abuse after suffering a head injury. Accounts from family members describe a household ruled by fear, where beatings were common and discipline was enforced unpredictably. His mother, Mercedes Munoz, worked long hours, leaving the children largely unsupervised. From an early age, Ramirez learned that violence was not an aberration, but a routine means of control. A pivotal influence in his childhood was his older cousin, Miguel Mike Ramirez, a decorated Vietnam War veteran. Miguel exposed Richard to graphic stories of wartime violence, Polaroid photographs of mutilated victims, and explicit discussions of rape and murder. These stories were not cautionary. They were presented as boasts. For a young boy already living in an abusive environment, they blurred the boundary between fantasy, admiration, and reality. The impact became more severe in 1973, when Richard, aged 13, witnessed Miguel shoot and kill his wife during an argument in the family home. Miguel was later found not guilty by reason of insanity. The incident reinforced a pattern that had already taken root. Violence could erupt suddenly, and accountability was uncertain at best. Ramirez's adolescence quickly deteriorated. He began abusing drugs, including marijuana and LSD, and withdrew from school, eventually dropping out in the 9th grade. He drifted between relatives, spent increasing amounts of time on the streets, and committed petty crimes. By his mid-teens, he had been arrested multiple times for burglary and drug-related offences. There was no single moment that transformed Richard Ramirez into a killer. Instead, his early life shows a steady accumulation of neglect, brutality, and exposure to extreme violence without consequence. Authority figures failed him, family structures collapsed, and the most vivid role model in his life glorified cruelty. By the time Ramirez left Texas for California in the early 1980s, he carried with him not only a criminal record, but a worldview shaped by fear, resentment, and desensitization. The foundations of what would soon terrorize Los Angeles were already firmly in place, long before his name became synonymous with the Night Stalker. By the spring of 1984, a series of seemingly unrelated crimes began to unsettle parts of Los Angeles County. At first, there was no clear pattern. Victims varied in age, gender, and background. Some attacks involved burglary and assault, others ended in murder. What connected them was timing. The crimes took place at night, often in the early hours of the morning, and they appeared to strike without warning. The violence escalated rapidly in 1985. Home invasions became more frequent, and the brutality intensified. Victims were attacked in their own bedrooms, the one place assumed to be safe. Windows were smashed, doors forced, and locks defeated with alarming ease. In several cases, the attacker lingered, moving through homes calmly, sometimes speaking to victims before attacking them. The randomness was deliberate and deeply unsettling. Media coverage amplified the fear. Newspapers and television reports began referring to an unidentified predator stalking the city after dark. By mid-1985, the name Night Stalker had taken hold. Residents altered their routines. Gun sales rose. People slept with lights on, barricaded windows, and kept weapons close at hand. In some neighbourhoods, community patrols formed as anxiety turned into vigilance. The geographical spread added to the confusion. Attacks occurred across Los Angeles, Orange County, and later San Francisco, frustrating efforts to link cases. Different police departments handled separate crimes, and early attempts to recognize a single offender were slowed by jurisdictional boundaries and differing crime scenes. What appeared chaotic, however, masked a growing consistency in method. The Night Stalker moved through the city on foot, by bus, and sometimes by car, selecting homes that appeared vulnerable. He targeted unlocked windows, open doors, and properties without obvious security. His crimes combined burglary, sexual assault, and murder in ways that defied easy categorization. The psychological impact was immense. The lack of a clear victim profile meant no one felt exempt. Elderly couples, young women, families, and lone men were all attacked. This absence of predictability created a sense that the city itself was under siege, that danger could arrive anywhere, at any time. By late summer 1985, Los Angeles was no longer simply investigating a crime spree. It was confronting a collective fear that reshaped daily life. The pressure on law enforcement intensified, and the demand for answers grew louder. Somewhere within the city, the Night Stalker was still moving freely, and every night without an arrest deepened the sense that control had slipped away. As the attacks continued through 1985, investigators began to recognize that the apparent chaos concealed a grim consistency. While the Night Stalker showed little regard for victim age or gender, his methods revealed a developing pattern rooted in control, intimidation, and ritualized violence. This was not an opportunistic burglary that occasionally turned lethal. It was a deliberate campaign of terror that evolved with each crime. The perpetrator typically entered homes at night, often between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., exploiting unlocked doors, open windows, or poorly secured entry points. Once inside, he moved confidently, sometimes waking victims before attacking them. Firearms, knives, blunt objects, and ligatures were all used, not interchangeably, but situationally. The variety of weapons complicated early efforts to link cases, yet it also reflected a willingness to adapt rather than hesitation. Sexual violence became a recurring element. In many attacks, Ramirez subjected victims to prolonged assault before killing them or leaving them severely injured. Survivors later described a man who seemed less interested in speed than domination, often forcing victims to swear allegiance to Satan or mocking them during the attack. These moments were not incidental. They were part of a ritual that reinforced his sense of power. The escalation was unmistakable. Early burglaries gave way to increasingly brazen home invasions. Murders became more frequent, and the level of violence intensified. In several cases, Ramirez mutilated victims after death, leaving behind deliberate marks of degradation. Crime scenes sometimes included symbols associated with Satanism, including pentagrams drawn in lipstick or blood, gestures intended to shock and confuse rather than serve any coherent belief system. Geographically, the crimes spread outward. Attacks in Los Angeles County were followed by incidents in Orange County and later San Francisco, confirming that the killer was mobile and willing to operate far beyond a single neighborhood. This movement further delayed recognition of a single offender and allowed Ramirez to continue largely unchecked. What ultimately distinguished the Night Stalker's crimes was not just their brutality, but their unpredictability. There was no cooling-off pattern that investigators could rely on, no stable victim profile to narrow warnings. Each new attack suggested that the killer was growing more confident, not more cautious. By late summer 1985, the picture had sharpened. Police were no longer searching for a burglar who sometimes killed. They were pursuing a serial predator whose crimes were driven by ritual, escalation, and an expanding sense of invulnerability. The window for stopping him was narrowing, and the cost of delay was measured in lives. By mid-1985, law enforcement agencies across Los Angeles County, Orange County, and later San Francisco were under intense pressure to identify and stop the Night Stalker. The scale of fear was unprecedented, but the investigation lagged behind the crimes themselves. What made the case so difficult was not a lack of evidence, but an excess of variation. Different weapons, different victims, and different locations blurred the connections investigators needed to see clearly. Early on, jurisdictional boundaries slowed progress. Burglaries, sexual assaults, and murders were often handled by separate units, sometimes even by different departments. It took time for analysts to recognize that these crimes, scattered across hundreds of miles, were the work of a single offender. When links were finally established, the task shifted from solving individual cases to stopping a mobile serial predator. Physical evidence provided only limited help. Fingerprints were recovered from several crime scenes, but they did not initially match any known offender in California's databases. Shoe prints became a crucial clue. Investigators identified a distinctive Avia athletic shoe print left behind at multiple scenes, a detail that helped confirm a single suspect, but did nothing to reveal his identity. Witness descriptions were inconsistent. Survivors described a man of medium height with dark hair and a lean build, but fear, darkness, and trauma affected recollection. Composite sketches were produced and circulated, yet none captured the complete likeness of the attacker. Meanwhile, false leads poured in. Thousands of tips flooded police switchboards as public anxiety tipped into suspicion. A breakthrough came only after the scale of the threat forced greater cooperation. Law enforcement agencies began sharing evidence and coordinating strategy. Media coverage, once criticized for fueling panic, became a tool. Surveillance footage from a convenience store in San Francisco captured the suspect's face during a stolen car transaction. Shortly afterwards, police publicly released a photograph and named Richard Ramirez as their suspect. The effect was immediate. Ramirez, who had relied on anonymity and mobility, was suddenly recognizable. His face appeared on television screens and newspaper front pages across California. For the first time, the advantage shifted. On the 31st of August 1985, Ramirez was spotted in East Los Angeles by residents who recognized him from the media. As he attempted to flee, a crowd pursued and subdued him, beating him severely before police intervened. He was arrested and taken into custody. The hunt ended not through forensic brilliance alone, but through visibility. Once the Night Stalker had a name and a face, the space in which he operated vanished. What followed would play out not on the streets, but in a courtroom, under a level of public scrutiny rarely seen in American criminal trials. After his arrest, Richard Ramirez was transferred into custody amid extraordinary public attention. The violence he had unleashed across California had already made him infamous, and his capture did little to calm public anxiety. Prosecutors quickly began assembling one of the largest and most complex criminal cases in the state's history, spanning multiple counties, dozens of charges, and an enormous volume of evidence. Ramirez was formally charged with 13 counts of murder, along with numerous counts of attempted murder, sexual assault, burglary, and other violent offences. The scope of the indictment reflected not only the number of victims, but also the geographical reach of his crimes. Coordinating testimony, forensic material, and witness accounts across jurisdictions posed a significant logistical challenge, and pre-trial proceedings stretched on for years. The trial itself began in 1988 in the Los Angeles Superior Court. From the outset, it became a media spectacle. Ramirez appeared in court dressed in dark clothing, sometimes wearing sunglasses, and frequently flashed a pentagram drawn on his palm. He smirked, stared at the cameras, and cultivated notoriety. For the families of victims, his behaviour added another layer of trauma. Turning proceedings meant to establish accountability into a public performance. Despite the theatrics, the prosecution's case was methodical. Forensic evidence linked Ramirez to multiple crime scenes through fingerprints, shoe impressions, DNA evidence, and ballistic analysis. Survivors testified, often reliving harrowing attacks in open court. Witnesses placed Ramirez near crime scenes, and stolen property from victims' homes was traced back to him. Unlike earlier stages of the investigation, the case presented to the jury was cumulative and overwhelming. The defense attempted to challenge the reliability of witnesses and the handling of evidence, but it struggled to counter the sheer volume of corroboration. Ramirez did not offer a coherent alternative explanation for his movements or possessions, and his courtroom behaviour did little to inspire confidence. On the 20th of September 1989, after months of testimony, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all major charges. The penalty phase followed swiftly. Ramirez was sentenced to death, a decision that reflected both the scale of his crimes and the calculated cruelty with which they had been carried out. The trial concluded one chapter of the Night Stalker case, but it did not end public fascination. The proceedings had transformed a man who once relied on anonymity into a figure permanently fixed in the public record, his violence dissected under the harshest possible light. Following his conviction and death sentence in 1989, Richard Ramirez was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he spent the remainder of his life on death row. Like many capital cases in California, his execution was delayed by the lengthy appeals process, and year after year passed with no resolution. For victims' families, justice remained legally complete, but emotionally unfinished. Ramirez showed little sign of remorse during his imprisonment. He gave sporadic interviews, maintained a small following of admirers who wrote to him and visited, and continued to cultivate the persona he had adopted during his trial. The attention disturbed many observers, reinforcing the concern that notoriety had become an extension of the violence itself. His legal appeals focused on procedural issues rather than innocence, and none succeeded in overturning his convictions. As the years passed, the likelihood of execution diminished. California's death penalty system slowed under legal challenges and political pressure, leaving Ramirez, like many others, in a prolonged state of limbo. On the 7th of June 2013, Ramirez died at the age of 53 from complications related to B-cell lymphoma while still on death row. His death ended the legal case without the finality many had expected or demanded. There was no execution, no closing ceremony of justice, only a medical pronouncement in a prison hospital. The impact of the Night Stalker crimes has endured long beyond Ramirez's death. Law enforcement practices evolved in response to the case, particularly in the coordination of multi-jurisdictional investigations and the management of serial offenders who crossed geographic boundaries. Public awareness of home security, once taken for granted, was permanently altered. Ramirez's name remains tied to a period of fear that reshaped daily life in Southern California. Yet the focus of history has increasingly shifted away from the killer himself and toward the victims whose lives were cut short or permanently scarred. Their stories, not his notoriety, now define the legacy of the Night Stalker. The chapter closed quietly in 2013, but the violence that made it necessary has never been forgotten, embedded in the collective memory of a city that once feared the night itself. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Murder, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactmurder.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, disasters, warfare, and mysteries. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/murdercoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.